In 1923, Germany was drowning in paper. Not newspapers, not books, money. The country was producing banknotes in denominations that would have sounded absurd only a few years earlier. Millions, billions, trillions, and eventually a note worth 100 trillion marks. The German Historical Museum records that by November 1923, the Reichsbank had issued notes reaching 100 trillion marks. At the end of that month, $1 was worth about 4.2 trillion marks. But this wasn't wealth. It was the opposite. The larger the numbers became, the less the currency could buy. People were being paid daily in some places. They carried their wages in bags and suitcases and rushed to exchange the money for goods before prices rose again. Imagine working all day and discovering that your paycheck was already losing value. So how did Germany get here? The story begins in 1914. Before World War I, Germany operated under a gold-based monetary system. But war changed the rules. When the war began in 1914, the Reichsbank suspended the convertibility of banknotes into gold. Germany needed enormous amounts of money to fight the war. And there was a problem. Wars are expensive. Soldiers need weapons. Factories need raw materials. Governments need to transport armies, feed populations, and keep entire industrial systems running. Germany chose to finance much of this through borrowing. Instead of raising enough taxes to pay for the war immediately, the government borrowed heavily from the public and increasingly from the Reichsbank. The Reichsbank could then put more money into circulation. More money, more debt, more pressure. But the country was at war. So the consequences were initially hidden behind the enormous demands of the conflict. Then Germany lost. In 1918, the war was over. But the bills remained. And now Germany had another problem. It had to rebuild a country damaged by war, while dealing with huge domestic debts, social spending, and the financial demands imposed by the victorious powers. The war had ended. The financial crisis had not. In fact, it was only beginning. After the war, Germany faced reparations. The exact amount was not written into the original Treaty of Versailles itself. In 1921, the Allied powers set the reparations figure at 226 billion gold marks, to be paid over decades, along with other obligations including coal deliveries and a share of export value. For Germany, this created a brutal financial problem. The government needed foreign currency and goods to meet external obligations. But Germany's own finances were already under enormous strain. Tax revenues were not enough to cover government needs. Debt was growing, and the government increasingly relied on the Reichsbank. The mechanism was deceptively simple. The government needed money. The central bank created more money. But creating money does not automatically create more factories. It does not create more coal. It does not create more food. It does not create more houses. If the amount of money grows much faster than the goods and services available to buy, prices can rise. And Germany's money supply was expanding while the country's economic situation remained deeply damaged. The mark began losing value. At first, this looked like inflation. Then something much more dangerous happened. People began losing confidence in the currency itself. And once people stop believing that money will hold its value, the entire system can accelerate. Then came January 1923. France and Belgium occupied Germany's industrial Ruhr region. Their goal was to force Germany to meet reparations obligations. The Ruhr was not just another piece of German territory. It was one of the country's great industrial centers, especially important for coal and heavy industry. Germany's government responded with what became known as passive resistance. Workers were encouraged to stop cooperating with the occupying forces. Factories and transport systems were disrupted. But there was a dangerous contradiction. If workers stopped working, they still needed to survive. So the German government promised financial support. It paid workers and others affected by the resistance. The economy was already struggling. Now a major industrial region was being disrupted. Government revenues were collapsing. But government spending continued. And the easiest source of additional money was the printing system. More money entered circulation. The inflation that had already been building since the war accelerated dramatically. The German Historical Museum describes the Ruhr crisis as a decisive factor that pushed the existing inflation into hyperinflation. The government had lost access to part of its productive capacity, but it still had printing presses. And those presses were about to become symbols of the crisis. At first, people could still adapt. Prices increased. Businesses adjusted. Workers demanded higher wages. But eventually, the system entered a vicious circle. Prices went up. Workers demanded more money. The government and businesses needed more money. More money entered circulation. Prices rose again, and everyone began expecting prices to rise tomorrow. That expectation itself became dangerous. Why? Because if you believe your money will be worth less tomorrow, you don't want to hold it today. You spend it. You buy food, coal, clothing, anything that might hold its value better than paper money. That pushes demand even higher. Meanwhile, sellers know that replacing their inventory will cost more tomorrow. So they raise prices. The currency begins moving faster and faster. The Deutsche Bundesbank describes the situation in 1923 vividly. Wages were paid daily in many places. People carried notes in bags and suitcases, and merchants repeatedly increased prices as the mark lost value. And then something psychologically devastating happened. People stopped thinking of money as wealth. Money became something you had to get rid of as quickly as possible. Behind every inflation statistic was a human being, a worker, a family, a shopkeeper, a pensioner, someone who had spent years saving. The German Historical Museum notes that by November 1923, the savings of countless families had been wiped out. War bonds that had once been considered safe were effectively destroyed by the collapse in the value of the mark. That distinction matters. A person who owned a factory might have physical assets. A person who owned land still had land. But someone whose life savings existed as a fixed amount of marks had a different problem. Their savings were denominated in the very thing that was collapsing. Imagine putting away money for 20 years. Imagine believing that those savings represent security. Then imagine waking up and discovering that the number in your account still exists. But what that number can actually buy has almost disappeared. This is why hyperinflation is not simply a story about prices. It's a story about trust. When the currency loses value, people don't only lose purchasing power. They can lose their sense that the economic system is predictable. And once that trust breaks, the crisis becomes much harder to control. By the second half of 1923, Germany's printing system was operating on an extraordinary scale. The German Historical Museum records that as the crisis reached its peak, up to 133 private companies using 1,783 printing machines worked for the Reich printing system. Around 30,000 people were involved in producing inflation notes. Yet even that enormous effort could not solve the problem. Because the problem wasn't simply a shortage of banknotes. The currency itself was losing value too quickly. Germany was producing more and more pieces of paper, while those pieces of paper were buying less and less. Even local authorities and companies began issuing their own emergency money. The German Historical Museum records that more than 5,800 cities, municipalities, and companies issued forms of emergency money during the crisis. Think about how strange that is. A country can print billions of banknotes, but it cannot print trust. It cannot print food. It cannot print coal. It cannot print industrial production. And it certainly cannot print confidence. Then came November 1923. The numbers became almost impossible to comprehend. The Reichsbank issued a 100 Trillion-Mark note. That's 100 trillion. But the number itself tells only half the story. The other half is purchasing power. By the end of November, $1 was worth around 4.2 trillion marks. The mark had effectively stopped functioning as a reliable store of value. The currency had become so unstable that ordinary economic calculations were becoming meaningless. And this is the moment when the title of this story becomes important. Germany didn't literally print money until the paper itself had zero value. It printed money while the currency's purchasing power was collapsing. That distinction matters, because hyperinflation isn't really about having lots of banknotes. It's about the destruction of the relationship between money and value. And Germany was approaching the point where that relationship had to be rebuilt from scratch. Eventually, Germany needed a new monetary system. In November 1923, the government introduced the Rentenmark. The old mark was replaced at an exchange ratio of 1 trillion old marks for 1 Rentenmark. This was more than changing the design of a banknote. It was an attempt to restore credibility. The German government needed to stop the monetary spiral. The currency needed a stable reference, and the economy needed people to believe that the new unit would actually retain value. The stabilization was followed by a broader restructuring of Germany's finances and international obligations. In 1924, the Dawes Plan helped reorganize reparations and international financial arrangements. Germany's currency crisis was finally brought under control. But control came at a terrible price. The old savings denominated in marks had been devastated. The financial world Germans had trusted before the war was gone. So what actually caused the German hyperinflation? It is tempting to give one simple answer: Germany printed too much money. That's true, but incomplete. The disaster developed through a chain of problems. World War I created enormous financial obligations. The government relied heavily on borrowing. The post-war economy was damaged. Germany faced reparations. Tax revenues were insufficient. The government increasingly relied on central bank financing. Then the Ruhr occupation disrupted industrial production. Passive resistance created additional government spending, and the resulting expansion of money supply happened while confidence in the currency was collapsing. The printing press was not operating in isolation. It was part of a much larger political and economic crisis. And that's the lesson. A currency doesn't become valuable because the government prints a beautiful piece of paper. Money works because people believe it can be exchanged for real things tomorrow. Food, energy, labor, products, services. If that belief disappears, the number printed on the note can become almost meaningless. Germany's hyperinflation is therefore not simply an old story about ridiculous banknotes. It is a story about what happens when debt, politics, production, and public confidence collide.